Good morning. Welcome to whatever this is this morning. And to my messy art station back there, because I'm in the middle of crafting. It is our first live stream of Morning Walk.
I don't know what happened to Nicole, so I'm just going to add myself in, and I'm going to add in Bassam, and I'm going to add in Becca. And it's the first time that we're doing the Facebook Live for the Artist Forge. So clearly Nicole has frozen in the most flattering position possible. And I'm sure she'll be incredibly happy with that. So good morning, guys. Welcome to this. Whatever this is, it's the non-Clubhouse version of the Artist Forge. How are you doing this morning, Becca, Bassam?
I'm doing fine. I was expecting Becca to be frozen this morning, not Nicole.
Yeah, all new. It's a whole new world, right? So usually we're all doing our thing, just kind of walking, listening, kind of half clubhousing, half paying attention. And now we have to be fully present. And I don't know what I'm doing this morning. And I don't think any of us are well caffeinated or make-upped enough to really be seen. But we're going to try this out and get used to it because studies are beautiful. So, in waiting for Nicole to come back, how was the weekend? I know Kat's going to be a little bit late. She's having some breakfast with her dad, I believe. But how are you guys doing?
Doing just great. Good weekend. Listen, last week you talked about inquiries starting to come in. It's actually going wild. I don't know what's happening. It's the last few days have been nothing but inquiries off my Google ad. So I've been busy with those. So that's good, but also enjoying the weekend. My wife is on vacation for 2 weeks and staying home essentially, staycation. Nice. So we're, it's going to be a lot of visitors and fun with friends.
Yeah, I'd be interested. At some point, we're going to have a conversation about Google Ads because I want to get an understanding of how long it's taking yours to really kind of take off. That's a whole another conversation for another day. For me, it's been a couple of months, and now they're starting to hit.
That's so, what it takes,
yeah. Becca, how are you?
Well,
almost awake.
Okay, almost good. Almost better than not.
Yeah, I don't know. I cooked myself and my household at the beach for like 5 hours yesterday, so we all slept pretty good. So that helps.
Nicole, you're back.
I'm having a morning. My whole ass computer just restarted. It was like, don't like it. So that's going to be fun to figure out what's causing that.
Big things for you, right? You're in the middle of this whole book launch, right? And it's getting kind of crazy. How's that going?
Yeah, everything launches officially tomorrow. So all the pre-sales will be done. The book will be live tomorrow in ebook, paperback, and hardback. So it is moving.
It's happening.
It is doing the thing.
Well, when we get to Friday and we do this again, I want to actually hear all about kind of the book launch, and we can talk about that and your process and all the pieces and components. And yeah, it'll be good, but it'll give you a platform, right? And I think it's been really interesting watching from the front, you know, as a consumer of your novels and a lover of the whole trilogy that you've got going. I'd love to hear more about kind of this process of launching the book, from when you started writing it to whatever level of frustration you're at now. You know, if you need someone to spell check, I'm happy to do it because I know how your spelling goes.
You're just terrible at spelling.
You can use all the words, just don't know how the letters rearrange correctly. All right. Well, anyway, I was just trying to fill time comedically until you got back. So welcome back to whatever this is.
Yeah, that was a mess. Okay, we can't start over because the internet lives forever. However, we can get a good introduction going. So welcome to what used to be Morning Walk with the Artist Forge. Justin is here today. I'm glad Justin's here. I'm going to share a picture of you this morning, Justin. So I'm glad you're hanging out. And my mama's here. Hi, Mama.
Hello, Mom.
So there's Kat. Good morning.
Morning.
Right, we are all here today, y'all. Obviously, what used to be morning walk and now can no longer be morning walk because I am not walking outside this morning. I am walking on a treadmill. So it's going to be morning talk with the Artists Forge. And we have been discussing over the course of the last few weeks visual literacy, the 3 pillars of visual literacy as artists, the things that we need to include when we're creating a piece of art, and how people will interpret that art based on the context. So where they see the art, what is included in and with the art, the internal language of the image. So what did the artist include in the image or the piece of art itself that helps us understand what it is and makes us feel certain things. And then the external language of the image. So not just the context, but what did the artist purposefully include with the piece of art to help us interpret it in certain ways. So that is the kind of overall game plan for discussing visual literacy. We already talked about context as far as where you encounter the piece of art, how the context through which you encounter the piece of art helps to determine how you're going to interpret it, such as if you see an image on a billboard versus if you see a sculpture in a museum or in somebody's home, the different ways that you're going to interpret what that art means, okay? And then moving on to how we see the art, the different levers in our brain that art pulls, whether they're evolutionary levers that have been keyed in by our evolution as humans and the things that we are tuned into, like movement and color and contrast, or whether that is the cultural interpretation, the lens through which we see, and how culture has built in the way that we understand things, like what color means in certain cultures versus certain symbols and how those are interpreted very differently depending on where you grew up. So in that internal language, we have talked already about things like theme and inspiration versus influence. So how those things can kind of help us move towards making an image and how the theme would influence what we do. And today we're going to talk about subject. And the great thing about that is subject can vary obviously as widely as art can vary, and subject can be anything from an object or an idea to a person or a very specific type of place. And sometimes the subject of the image can be thoughts or feelings or questions, dynamics of relationships. And then as the artist, we have to decide how we want to go about proving to the audience that that's what the subject is. We have a couple of example images I just grabbed from my library really quickly this morning so we can kind of look at some of those and break them down. And I'm going to grab images we've actually used before because we have some passing familiarity with those, so we can, we can kind of do that. But in the future, we'll be looking at also traditional pieces of art from the community, also art from our founders. So with that being said, I want to begin by just inviting the audience. If you have thoughts this morning, don't forget, you can share them in the comment section and we can grab your thoughts and pull them up on screen and we can engage with your ideas and your questions as we go about. That's the whole reason for doing this live, is being able to get your feedback as we go. So, and Sarah's with us this morning. Good morning, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
So to begin with, for the founders, y'all, many of you I know have already kind of predefined subject matter just by the genre in which you work, right? As photographers who generally shoot people. But I know that you often are technically trying to shoot more than that. Like you have a person, but there is an idea. And we talked about theme behind that as well. And I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on how that subject matter influences the way that you go about creating the art? Because I know when you're photographing people, there are a lot of considerations to include, such as things that are going to flatter them, right? And then how you make creative decisions based on the subject matter and what else you include in the image. So as we get into this morning, before we look at some examples, I'm just wondering, do you have any initial thoughts as artists on subject matter in general and how you treat that when you're putting a piece of work together?
So one of the things that I've been kind of journaling about, working through, especially over like the last 2 years. I love that you said flatter your subject, because what is presumably, posing or styling aspects that would flatter a subject, those proverbial rules are changing, right? Which I think is fucking awesome. And so the evolution of our work in determining, like, with, paid client work, is understanding what their version of feeling flattered visually looks like and feels like for them. And understanding that moving forward, I think, is going to actually influence most portrait artists' work, for anybody that is actually like trying to create work that is something that their clients enjoy and adore, which I'm just, I'm all about it.
Yeah. Oh, you're muted, Nicole. But yes. Okay, there's noise in the background. No, absolutely, Kat. I think we have to go back to context in the type of photography that you and I do, and maybe Matt does. We have to go back to context of who is the audience, who is the client, who is this for, right? If we were taking portraits of people to kind of sell them in an art museum or sell them online, it would be a different kind of context than what we do, which is take portraits for everyday people, average people that are there to treat themselves to, with a specific purpose, specific intent. So it is extremely important that to figure out what, how do they see themselves, as you said, right? What's important to them. And we can, that sometimes we when we triage pictures, when we cull pictures, we may choose 50 pictures that we absolutely adore, and they hate every single one of them because there's one feature on their face that they don't like, right? So it's important to find out, at least in the type of photography that I do, what is it that that draws them to a picture? What is it that distracts them from the picture? And I do that very early on, not just through the consultation and all the discussions we have, and trying to get to know them, and prepping for the shoot, and prepping for the outfits, and what they want to get out of it, and so on. But very early on in the shoot, I usually, I shoot in a studio, and I shoot in my house, and I usually start in the studio with a tethered to a computer, and it's specifically to get feedback from them on how they see themselves, right? So that gives me kind of an additional method of validating. Here's a few pictures. We're fooling around. I'm still setting up lighting. I'm still fooling around. Hey, what do you think of this? Which side is better? How do you find this expression? Do you see yourself in this? And that draws out a little bit more from them to a point where it guides what I do next. And it's extremely important because at the end of the day, the purpose is to have pictures that they love and they adore and they connect with.
Interesting. I actually will, like, absolutely, positively, wholeheartedly refuse to shoot tethered with clients, because, and it's sort of the flip side of what you were just saying, Bassam, because they will immediately focus on everything that they hate and stay there and try and micromanage my direction from the space of all the things that they don't like based on those first few images. Which is also, though, why I will show them everything instead of culling things down, because I could choose 40, 50 images that I absolutely adore, and they look at them and they're like, thanks anyway, right? But when I started showing all 50, they were choosing 20 and 30 images that I wouldn't have even been like, nope, sorry.
Yeah.
And yeah, once I started doing that, like, then they get to determine how to move forward, and they're not spending all the time like totally hating on themselves, which affects their mindset for the rest of the shoot. Like, that's interesting.
Yeah, well, I do the same as you, and I learned to do it through time. I used to do a reveal, a printed reveal, and only 20 to 30 pictures. And now I do a digital, and I show anywhere between, I don't know, usually about a 70 to 80 to 100, 120 pictures, exactly for that reason, right? But I honestly, I don't find it works against me. I don't shoot tethered all the time because most of my shoots are in the house, and I do, boudoir and lifestyle type photography. So I don't tether when I'm in the house, but I do that when we're doing portraits and personal branding and so on. And I honestly, it doesn't really work against me in that respect, in that I'm confident with what I do. And most of the time they are surprised, but I do pick up these little nuances, right? I mean, if somebody is really, I don't know another word other than difficult, or at least they really have an issue with with finding anything positive about their face or their looks. I mean, that's an issue whether you're tethered or not, right? And you deal with it. But by tethering, by showing, by seeing how they react, it gives me hints. It gives me an idea of where to go with it.
No, I get where you're coming from. I don't 1,000% agree on the point of the rest of it, but I can see like the thought process behind it.
I want to jump in really quick because I think this is super interesting in the difference between how artists are dealing with subject matter. So in my case, and then I'll have to see where you fall in this, Becca, but as somebody who gets to be fully in charge of what happens with the subject, I don't have to consider what the person I'm photographing or drawing or painting, how they see themselves or what they think of themselves. I get to decide how I'm going to show them based on what I want to say about the subject matter. And so it's really cool to think about from the different sides of artistry, right? When you are creating for a client versus when you are creating for yourself or your own ideas, and how you have to consider subject in an entirely different manner and from a perspective that, you know, informs what decisions you make, such as, you know, Bassam, you mentioned shooting with somebody tethered. So for folks, if you're here today and you're not an artist, or if you're listening in a blog or in the podcast and you are not a photographer, when you are photographing somebody, you can hook your camera up to your computer and allow the subject to see the photographs that you are taking. And if you want to, and they can help make decisions. So from that perspective, Bassam, it's really interesting to think about bringing them in as not necessarily a creative director, but as somebody who can approve and say, yes, this makes me happy, or no, this doesn't make me happy. And the decisions then that you make based on who this person is and what they need from you then inform your decisions on lighting and color and all that kind of stuff. And I know for Kat, you do that before the shooting ever starts, right? Like these decisions and these conversations are had based on what people need beforehand. And so that informs how you, I'm going to say, call it treat the subject, which is kind of the same thing that all artists do. But it's really cool to look at it from the perspective of when we have somebody who gets input on how we treat the subject versus when it's just us and we are the one directing how we treat the subject and how that changes things.
That was a question, right?
Just kind of an observation, like that is just really interesting. So even as, so I might have a commission as an illustrator and have somebody say, you know, I need this for a book cover. Here's the character, here's who they are, here's what I want the viewer to think about them, right? Or I may ask the questions to help pull these out. But then as we're doing revisions and I have what might be a finished product and I show that to them and they say, oh, you know, I don't think they look scary enough, or, you know, they're going to give me feedback on the things that they like or don't like. And then I have to adjust my treatment of the subject based on what the viewer sees, what the client sees. And in a way, y'all are kind of doing that in real time, right? Versus when I'm making a piece of art just for me as an artist that I may decide to go sell as a print, even if I'm photographing a person that is my subject, they don't get input. They are there in order to play a role, in order to bring something to life. And I am there to decide how the treatment of the subject goes. And like you, Kat, I generally start way, way before we shoot and figuring out things like wardrobe and costuming and color palette and location and all of those kinds of things inform how the viewer is going to interpret the subject matter versus like when they have a say, then I have to. So it's just interesting to think about that from both perspectives, especially for artists maybe who don't do commissions to have to think about that, you know?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead, Matt.
No, Becca, go ahead.
Well, I feel like the greater like subject question here is less necessarily treatment, but how did you choose the subject in general from the get? I mean, like, why in this case, in the book commission scenario, right? You know, you have made some sort of decision somewhere in your lifetime to pursue that kind of art, to pursue that subject matter that is character portraits and fantasy. And then for the same for Bassam and Kat, they have chosen primarily portraiture, because I haven't really seen anything that's not explicitly portraiture from either of you, as your primary subject matter. So I'm curious kind of where, like, was that a very formal kind of decision? Was it just something like that's just always what was of interest? Or like, why is that the subject versus anything else?
So I've always loved portraits. And even when I photographed landscape, right? Like I led a group of photographers in Yellowstone and then again in Costa Rica. And that were primarily like birders and landscape photographers. I still make portraits of those things. Like even like I can try to shoot sports, and guess what? It looks like portraits. I can try to do digital art. Every digital art piece that I've ever made ends up being a fucking portrait. Like it's all, and this goes back to, you know, being a kid. Even when I would paint, you know, like you get that paint set when you're actually, no, the very first piece I did was a mixed media piece of oil and acrylic of a rainbow across a sheet of canvas paper. And then I got in trouble for mixing mediums. But outside of that, every piece of art that I've ever made always ends up being a portrait of some kind. And so I've always leaned in that space. When I tried to be a wedding photographer for 2.5 years, guess what? All of my wedding photos still look like damn portraits. So, I mean, it wasn't so much that I choose portrait. I think portrait chose me.
It's been interesting to listen to all of this, and there are bits and pieces that I use. I think from a visual literacy perspective, as I think about subject, right? It's less about the person in front of me. It's less about the background. It's more about the overall emotion that's being conveyed, right? So when I think about the subject, it's less about the person or the set. It's what do I want? If it's a personal branding session, I want that confidence and approachability to come through. If it's something more dramatic, I want that to come through, the expression, the feeling, the emotion, right? And there are everything that I hear from Bassam and Kat, Nicole and Becca. There are bits and pieces that I use, whether it's shifting on the fly, because my stuff is creative real time, right? I'm retail photography. I'm not creating stuff for book covers and fantasy stuff. I'm doing real time retail photography. So the subject is always going to be the client of some sort, but I want to get that emotion to be front and center. That's what I want the viewer to connect with, right? I want their customers to be able to see things and understand who this person is. So I work with the client and their personality to bring out the emotion that they want. That to me is the subject. If there are things that can enhance that around the subject, whether it's a prop or a color or a lighting scheme or whatever, that's where I'm focused when I'm thinking about the subject itself. So, you know, from that visual literacy perspective, that's about as far as I go with it. I'm not micromanaging every little component. I get lazy and leave a lot of room for fluidity of, you know, is it that important? Is it not? I'm not that particular about a lot of what's in the background. So, you know, when it comes down to it, I think for me, the subject is less about the person themselves. It's more about that connection, that emotion. That's what I want to come through. So how do I enhance that to best tell the story that I'm trying to tell? And, you know, if I can get there closely in my mind, awesome. If the client has additional input, I'll take it or leave it, but I can generally verbally dance around whatever suggestions they might have if I don't feel like it contributes to the overall subject. So does that make sense? But I think, you know, everybody's got such great points. I feel myself connected to every little bit of it. But we all do it a little differently. What's that, Becca?
I have a question. So that's interesting. And I like that kind of differentiation between subject and subject matter. Do you feel like if you maybe, because you've done your own creative work and like, you know, personal work and stuff like that. So if the emotion is the subject that you're pursuing in the personal work, do you feel like the subject matter, like the actual, like the model or the landscape or whatever, could be interchangeable and since it is less important than the emotional subject.
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, if you think happy, right? Happy could be playing with a dog. Happy could be seeing a loved one come back from overseas for the first time. Happy could be I just put something up and I didn't kill myself doing it. Like, that's generally what at the end of each day I'm like, I didn't electrocute myself today. That's pretty good. I didn't die. One more day. So I look at it as, you know, if that's the subject that I want something happy, it can really be anything. And I just work the system to that. I don't know if this is answering your question, but yeah, that's really kind of the way I approach it, Becca. Does that make a difference?
I think it's simple. It's very simple. I think it's a matter of choice, right? When you're doing what we do, we don't have a choice of who the subject matter is. Right. So you have to take, that's what you have. You're not going to say, hey, I'm going to take your brother instead of you because they'll look happier on the screen. We don't have a choice. Right. So then the choice becomes into what do you bring? What do you make of that? But you are in a way limited to that subject matter, and they play a huge role in how, whether you are successful or not, and so on. Whereas in the opposite case, what you guys do, you have a choice of both, right? So you can choose exactly what you want to convey, exactly what you want to do, and go out and find somebody, find a subject, find a scene, find a whatever that will do exactly what you want to do. So a lot more control, a lot more choice in what you do, right? And you don't have to do it in real time, as you said earlier, right?
It's so easy what you guys do. It's so easy.
Yeah.
Just skating by over here in easy land.
No, but does that make sense? I mean, that's essentially what. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those are kind of some of the self-imposed limitations that we have, set up based on, what our chosen discipline is, and that's just kind of part of the thing. And then, on the opposite side, we have to create everything that's in the frame, including choosing the person who fits the vision or drawing the person, and so it all comes with its own sets of limitations. But I think what's really interesting here is we've kind of canvassed subject matter from a couple of perspectives, from whether we're the one choosing the subject or whether the subject is the person commissioning the image. And then when we're looking at the subject from a perspective of, is this a person? And then we're then saying, hey, look at this person. Or is this an idea? And we're saying, hey, here's what sadness feels like, or what happens when people don't like where they live, or what does it feel like to be in a certain landscape? So we have a few comments that I wanted to grab. Justin was commenting a little bit earlier, but I didn't want to jump in the middle of the conversation, saying that he uses a mirror for his subjects so they can kind of see what they're doing as a guide to help.
So that's an interesting one before you go on, because I used to do that. I used to have a mirror in my studio, a big, tall, stand-up mirror. And I found that most of the time I missed people looking in the camera because they're always looking at the mirror. So I stopped doing that completely for that reason.
Yeah, and I think we're all probably going to have, different and unique experiences with what it's like to try to get somebody to see themselves or to understand what they're doing when they pose. And Kat also Nina agreeing with Kat, saying, yep, even if I photograph a horse, it turns into a portrait. I don't know what a horf is, but maybe that's something Becca can create. It sounds like a monster. It turns into a portrait. Sharon's here with us listening. Good morning, Sharon. We're so glad to have you with us this morning. And then if you are on Facebook, remember, you do have to give StreamYard permission if you want your name to show up. If you don't, that's totally cool. But this, our friend in Facebook, saying, what's the subject? I need some context.
This is funny.
If you
this is like who's on first, right? Who's on first? Exactly.
It is. What's the subject?
Is the subject.
The subject. So we are talking about visual literacy, and as artists, there are several different pieces of technique that we are including in a piece of art that help the viewer understand what the piece is about. Things like composition and color palette that make up the internal language of the image. And then the subject matter, right? Which can be a subject, a person, a bike, a tree, a place, or can be an idea. And then we choose what visual elements to include and how to include them based on what we want the viewer to understand or believe about the subject matter. So we're actually going to grab some examples and break them down really quick, asking ourselves, what's the subject? And then how do we know? So visually, how do we know that this is the subject? And hopefully that will help us kind of understand what it looks like to choose a subject and then how we treat it within the frame so that the viewer interprets things the way that we want them to. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to grab Photoshop real quick, beginning with a photo of somebody who's here and joining us today, Justin, who has been a subject of mine many times in the past. And I know for people who have been here for a while, this is probably an image that they are familiar with. But if I were to ask, what is the subject of this image? Friends in the comments, who are watching today, if you respond, go ahead and respond. Remember, it can be the person, it can be the clothes, it can be an idea, it can be a feeling, it can be a location. It all depends on how the artist has treated the image. So what would you say is the subject matter in this image?
I'm not trying to imagine this as a clothing ad, and no.
And no, it's not.
No.
I immediately started hearing Me and My Uncle from the Grateful Dead in the back of my mind. And yeah, I think there's this, robbery gone wrong, right? And that to me, or something dramatic, that's the subject to me. It's less about the guy with the beard and the hat and the bullet wounds and the money. But all of that contributes to whatever the subject is. Subject, story, right? It starts to become vague, the connection between the two. But that's the way that I look at it.
Okay, so in your eyes, subject is robbery gone wrong. The story of what has brought this image to be.
Exactly. Yep.
Fair. Some people Sharon saying the subject is a Western bandit. Our Facebook friends saying this becomes so important in advertising, especially as we have smaller subjects that we present as a broader lifestyle, which is 100% true. And it's brilliant that you brought that up. Because given our different disciplines or given the genres that we work in, we have to treat the subject matter in a way that lets the viewer interpret it how we intend to, which means making a lot of really careful choices, which is why you so often see whiskey ads in very warm circumstances, right? Like there's fire or there's something that harkens to our popular view of what whiskey is and where it should be. And the same thing is true in this circumstance with the image. So, since we have a few to get through today, I want to make sure that we do that. So if anybody else wants to state what they think the subject of this image is, now would be the time to do it. And then we'll break down some of the reasons behind why we believe whatever we believe about the subject matter. Just giving friends in the audience some time, just in case I don't want to rush anybody. But so Lindsay's saying person, always the person. There may be a greater purpose that is supposed to take the front place, like a clothing ad, a movie, etc. But the person or character will always be the subject, not necessarily the person in reality, but the person, character, whatever it is that they're becoming.
Yeah, but that's a very true statement, because regardless, we're looking at this picture, I'm looking at this picture, and I'm thinking exactly about what's that person thinking, what's behind them, what's on their mind, why are they dressed like that? So it's all about the person to try to put it in that greater, broader sense of the overall image. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll see hopefully a couple of images later that are skirting the line between what the subject matter is, and hopefully that'll help us get an idea of how, as what Matt was saying, and Lindsay also so brilliantly said, the person may be the subject, but they might not necessarily be what's important. Like the subject itself may include a person for the purposes of helping us interpret, but the person may not even be the most important part. So we'll break that down. But I think you guys have hit the nail on the head. So obviously, the subject is a Western man in a robbery gone wrong. And there are lots of context clues that point to that, right? Of course, like the blood and the torn clothing. He's very dirty. He's got sunburned and wind-chapped cheeks. He's got money coming out of a saddlebag, and he's out in the middle of the desert with no horse and no nothing. So clearly something has gone wrong. And everything that's in this image serves to inform us about this person, which makes us ask the questions that Bassam has asked and that Matt has said. is how did this person get here? Why are they there? What are they thinking? Which is the story itself. So the story might be the subject matter, and the person is the subject that helps the viewer experience it, right? So we have a lot of things that are working together at once. And imagine really quickly, instead of this outlaw standing here, we had a woman in a pink dress carrying high heels over her shoulder with messy hair and mascara running down her face. Now the subject matter and the subject are entirely different, even though we're using the same location and maybe similar emotion, right? Entirely different subject matter, even if the treatment is similar.
Well, that depends. Is she carrying a purse full of money?
That's my question.
Right.
Right? Because that might look like a walk of shame, but if she's carrying a bag full of cash, like, we can hang out.
We can hang out. But no, I mean, that's exactly the question, right? Because while Justin was the perfect choice for this series, he has the look that I wanted. This is the subject I chose. I could have very easily chose a woman in the same garb, a woman to come out and play the outlaw, or I could have chosen anything else, anybody else. That subject matter was my choice based on what? Based on the story that I wanted to tell. So then each of us as artists, those are the decisions we make. Whether the subject is chosen for us, the subject matter then kind of forces interpretation on what we include in the frame. So if I have a client come to me and they just say, I want an image where I see myself as brave. Well, the bravery is the subject matter. Like, that is the important part. This person wants to see themselves that way. So how do I make the subject look brave? How do I do that? What do I include in the frame? And like this image, am I shooting up at the person, putting them in a position of power over the viewer? What kind of colors am I including? Are they bold and brave? What are the props that are in there? What are they wearing? All of those things are the treatment of the subject that helps us interpret who this person is, what's the story behind why they're there, all of those things. I'm going to try to move quickly through a couple more. So I mentioned the difference between the subject and the subject matter, right? So the subject of the image, a person, right? It's still a person. But is it? Like, the person is the most important position in the frame. But is this person, this blonde-haired woman, is she what's important? I'm asking these questions honestly, because I obviously have my own thoughts, but we're conversating about this as a group. So is she the subject matter?
I feel like she's secondary to nature. I think nature is the subject, and this is the interaction with it, right? So she's not necessarily the subject of focus, but she adds to the story. Just the way that I'm seeing it on first impression.
So I will challenge you, Matt. I don't know if it's the nature or the road.
It's too early to be challenged.
The road itself is the subject, but perhaps more the relationship between her and the road.
Totally, both completely fair interpretations. I'm wondering from our audience today, what do y'all think? Is the woman in this image the subject? I mean, she is the subject, but is she the subject matter?
I would say the journey. Like, I know that's kind of splitting hairs with Becca's point about the road, but like, just from the framing itself, the fact that we're looking at her experiencing from behind, her body language is intimating like she's still just kind of like do, right? But because of the depth there, with the path in front of her, it's like, okay, what's really happening here, right? What are we talking about?
But it's that famous stick some time to smell the flowers or smell the coffee, or that's what's coming out here, and that's to me that's the subject here. Right? It's self-reflection and taking the time to enjoy.
To jump out and just like slaughter.
Come along with me, little girl. So Sharon says saying wanderlust feels like the subject. Justin saying the journey feels like the subject. And I think everybody is really kind of hitting the nail on the head here. While the person is technically the subject, I'm photographing her in this surroundings. She is not the subject matter, right? The connection with nature, the feeling of moving along a path into somewhere magical. Hopefully what the viewer sees is I kind of would like to be there. Like I want to be walking around in the golden afternoon, smelling the flowers in my pretty dress, you know. This idea that she then represents something that we can go and take part in, or that people can, like we connect to this idea, then the idea becomes the subject matter, and she becomes the kind of a vehicle for us to experience that thing or to have questions about that thing.
Now, Nicole, I'm curious with this, just by changing one element like the crop, right? How does that affect the viewer's interpretation of the subject itself? Like if you took in and just went super tight on her.
Yeah. And we've had, I think I might actually have, so we've had that conversation, and I think it was Wynn who brought it up. Whoops, don't do that. It was Wynn who brought it up so beautifully when he talked about the difference between a portrait of a woman and a portrait of a dress. And it was for this image in particular. So in this crop, particularly, I think since the subject is not making eye contact with the camera, we're almost in a voyeuristic point of view because we're behind the flowers a little bit. So we're looking at this person. If we were to crop in like this, right? All of a sudden, she is the absolute point of interest. There might be some flowers and we can tell we're outside, but the whole purpose of this shot now is her face, right? Like that's the big, most prominent focus point of everything. But when we come back out here to the chosen crop, all of a sudden she's a part of nature. She's almost getting swallowed up by the nature. And even though she's obviously a very prominent part of this, the question starts to become a little bit more hairy. Like, is it her, or is it just her, or is it her and nature? Like we start to open that up, I think, for a little bit more for interpretation, which goes exactly to the point of, as the artist, these creative choices that we're making on how we show the subject and how that gets interpreted then by the viewer. And as I think, you know, Wynn had said this as well, but this could very much be a negative choice in cropping because it leaves so much room for interpretation. Is it her? Is it the nature? It's not super clear, right? Unless that's the intent, then maybe this wasn't entirely the right choice of a crop. But we get to decide that for ourselves based on how we want to treat the subject. So I think that's a really fantastic question, Kat, because even painters have to make that decision, you know, when they're putting an image together from scratch. Where do I put the subject and how do I make that clear? Through contrast, through color, through, you know, movement and everything else. So then here's a big random one. What's the subject?
What am I looking at?
Some camera from a war zone with two vehicles going down the road.
Clearly, that's a moon. Oh, that was. I thought that was the Death Star up in the sky. That's gone. Well, there goes my whole thought about it being Tatooine. All right, well, that's out.
Let's zoom in a little bit.
Are they cars or are they trees? It feels like it's taken, you know, it gives me like road trip vibes.
Well, they are trees, I believe, but they look like military vehicles also from far.
That's very interesting.
Now, if this was Lindsay's picture, it would be peas on a table.
It would be peas. I love Lindsay's peas so much. If you're in the audience today, what would you say if you look at this image? What is the subject? This is a kind of a shot that was never like fully intentioned to see the light of day, or I should say like a large audience. Lindsay knows the peas. So because we don't have a whole bunch of time, what if you saw this image and there was a title on this image? that said road trip in New Mexico.
See? That's what it says.
That would aid in the interpretation, right? But there's a lot of visual things that are happening here. Anybody who's familiar with the Southwest will be very familiar with this kind of view where there's just nothing but yellow and blue off into the distance, all, washed out from the sun. Landscape. But that's the landscape is there. It is the subject of the image. The landscape is. I still think it's awesome. I was able to capture these two equidistant bushes in exactly the middle of the frame. But for me, as my first trip through New Mexico purposefully, this absolutely represents what it feels like to be driving through the Southwest in a car. And that's the subject, the ultimate subject, right? The subject matter is that feeling of being in the car and watching this blur of blue and yellow go by. And to make that subject accessible to the viewer, it has to have a subject. Make the subject matter accessible to the viewer, it has to have a subject. I think we have one more to look at that will hopefully help. Dang it, I always push the wrong buttons. Okay, so subject and subject matter. What would we say they are?
The makeup. Damn.
Makeup artist is. Her name is Kat DeJesus. She's awesome. Right. It's Justin echoing there. The makeup. Makeup is the subject. Subject matter, I should say.
Yeah. Because I mean, still, this is a case of where the face or the person is definitely subject without question, but the makeup ends up as the subject matter.
Right. And so if we look at the difference between the treatment here and the treatment of the subject in a shot like this, we can definitely see that there is a difference in purpose behind the camera, right? So this is very much zoomed in, hyper perfect. The lip is popping. In fact, everything has been treated with some green in order to make that lip pop even further. She's not making eye contact with the camera. She's not inviting us in any way. She's serving as a canvas, right? Which is what we see in most beauty imagery. That's how you tell the difference between a commercial beauty image and a beauty portrait, right? In the beauty portrait, we are treating the subject as the subject matter. They are the person, they're the thing. We want to pay attention to them and how lovely they are. In this, the model has become a canvas and we're paying attention to the makeup. So hopefully, let me go ahead and stop sharing these. Hopefully, just by being able to look at some of those images after we had talked about, subject in general, we're able to start telling some difference between subject and subject matter, but also how we treat it, because that's the real question. You and I could photograph a bike, and if you photograph it on the ground surrounded by broken glass, and I photograph it tied to a playground and there's kids running around in the background, the subject matter might be two totally different things, right? So I want to make sure we open this up for some conversation or questions that our friends in the audience might have today. But after having this conversation, do you guys have any thoughts, or as we start to near the end of the hour, anything you want to leave folks with today?
I think, through the past couple of conversations that we've had, there's been shades of gray between theme, subject matter, right? And I think some of that for me comes down to, for the work that I do, don't overthink it. Just understand kind of what the intention of this image is going to be. And then I can start to pinpoint on different things if I'm feeling it's weak in one area or another. But because I tend to move so quickly, just applying the the concepts of this visual literacy to the work, the subject matter, the theme, the color, the composition, right? All of these components do play in. Sometimes it's a little bit more intuitive than others, but I don't want people that are listening to think that you have to so hyper fixate on subject when you're doing certain types of work. There are times where you absolutely need to do that, but just an understanding of how these things all play together is really, it's starting to connect better for me, the different components of it, rather than me going into it 2 weeks ago where it's just like, I don't know, I just kind of put someone there and I take a picture and I'm done, right? So I'm feeling like this is all starting to make a little bit more sense to me as well as I get better with understanding visual literacy.
I think that's kind of great, Matt, because like you're so this example today, and then when we were talking about a theme last week, and you'd mentioned you're not explicitly pursuing certain themes, but then seeing them emerge out of your work anyway, in hindsight. And I feel like this is kind of an excellent way of depicting kind of how visual literacy is an innate language, whether we are actively pursuing it or not. And so there is going to be that subject when you take a photograph, whether you intend to go chase that subject or not. It exists. And someone is going to be able to speak that language and understand what that subject is. They're going to see a theme, whether you intentionally went and said that or not. So there is this underlying level in, I would say, I mean, maybe all kinds of works of art that people are going to pick up and translate to themselves.
Yeah, I think that that's what makes this conversation so great. And I remember when the coach was with us regularly, and we had this conversation, and he was, pushing back a little bit. He's like, I don't think you can control people that way, and I just, that's just how you think and everything. And it's so interesting because it's arguing for visual literacy from the opposite side, right? It's saying that there's so much of this that is intuitive, that we don't always have to think of everything all the time because we speak that language. It's almost like if you were to slow down long enough to think about grammar and syntax and how you're punctuating the words that you say with internal commas and periods, using the pauses in your voice and all of that stuff, you would go crazy. You'd be like, did I just start a sentence with a preposition? Oh my God, right? But no, you don't do that. You just speak, because we all speak this language that we understand. And the same thing is true for visual literacy. So much of it is intuitive that we don't always have to overthink it, which Sharon is saying, she's with you, Matt, like she could fall into that category. Overthinking can become her biggest hang up. Justin's saying, just go with the flow with slight direction. But when we talk about visual literacy, when we go back, it's the same thing as a writer going back and maybe studying grammar and say, if I understand the mechanics of this, can I better get across my point? Especially if we look at our work and we say, I think I have room to grow here, right? If we don't understand the mechanics of how an image comes together to speak to somebody, how do we know what to improve on it?
And this is one of the things that I have with posing guides for portraiture, right? Is posing guides are great when you don't know where to start or how to do anything, and you can get someone into that position. Thereby you have like basics of composition and general body position, right? So you don't have to think too hard about all that. But it still doesn't mean just because you have the pose down that subject is going to come through the right way or the emotion is going to come through the right way. It's a starting point, right? And that's why I think a lot of this is starting point stuff for you to get your own voice, your own images to come through in the way that you want. But just understanding the pose and how people need to be gets you, 30% of the way there. And then you can start adjusting that. Kat?
Well, it elevates your baseline.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you for saying that.
It's not just, because I think everybody here has probably, directed a pose and then realized like it's just awkward and feels uncomfortable, looks uncomfortable, for the subject in place, and it's just not working. Right. But that doesn't mean that you have to shake it off and start all over. You can say, okay, what one thing can I change? And I hammer that rule into everybody that I mentor. Like, oh, but I get locked up and I can't remember, about posing specifically. And it's like, to take a beat. What one thing can you change about the current position? Now, if, you've got her foot behind her head and, obviously that's not sustainable, right? But that doesn't mean you have to start from the beginning. right? You just, okay, what one thing can you change? Is that moving the chin this way, moving the chin that way, engaging that front shoulder, bringing that hand up, coming across here, run through there. And it's just one thing at a time. So
and they can all say different things. They can all say or mean different things. Yeah, I love that.
Or, maybe it isn't the pose that you want to change, right? Maybe the posing's great, but your light is just, it's not in line with what you're trying to bring forward with your subject, whether it's for commercial work, creative work, or, paid client work, right? Like if the wardrobe doesn't feel in alignment with the light, with the pose, with the makeup, like if there's something there that's out of whack, right? Oh, okay. Understanding all of the components for the levers that you can pull in visual literacy will get you to that endpoint much faster. So you can make make decisions more quickly, which gives you the option to make a more dynamic range of work.
You got to make decisions more better. You got to understand the language first.
More better, faster now.
More better. So Lindsay, great comment saying, my work is a regular discussion with my husband who doesn't quite understand why I keep taking photos of myself. He keeps seeing it like a selfie or vain need to reproduce myself. And I'm like, it's me and my story, but it's not me. It could be anyone. I just use myself. The subject matter is a much larger than just a representation of herself. And I think that's a beautiful way to kind of begin to end this conversation, because that's absolutely right. And here's an interesting thing. If I'm looking at a posing guide, is the woman in the guide the subject? Yeah, she's the subject. She's not the subject matter. The pose is the subject, right? Like that's the important thing. How do I know that? Because it's in a posing guide. It's the context, right? And then it's the way it's treated. We're probably looking at the same light setup in several different poses. And so all the treatment all the way around is telling me that the woman might be the subject who's being photographed, but she's not important. The pose is important. And so even just like looking at that and Lindsay's example, she's using herself because she has herself there, to work with. She can probably take all that extra time because it's her and not having to try to pose somebody. But the subject matter is the idea, right? That is the thing. And then how do we communicate that as artists using all of the skills we're going to talk about in the conversations that are coming up later this week and next week, where we're asking ourselves about prop, and we're asking ourselves about clothing, and we're asking ourselves about environment and composition and color palette and contrast and all of those things. That is how we communicate to the viewer. What is the subject of this? And what am I trying to say about it? So hopefully starting broad like this and then starting to narrow down helps to give us an idea. And our friend in Facebook land saying, start with a solid foundation and let it flow from there. And that is a great way to think of this all, because if we understand that, theme and influence and then subject matter kind of sit as a foundation for everything else, how we dress it all up then becomes the question. What does it look like? Is it a Grecian temple, or is it a Mayan temple, or is it, a temple in Southeast Asia? I mean, they all may serve similar purposes and look completely different, or maybe the purposes are different and the way that it's treated has just fooled you. You don't know, because you need to know more about it, which is what the rest of visual literacy is. So super glad that everybody joined us this morning on our first live walk and talk, where everybody's here and we're doing it on purpose instead of being on Clubhouse. I already missed it this morning. I was like, now people have to see me. Man. But hopefully having these conversations together with you all in the morning, and then also getting to see visually some examples of the things that we are discussing will really help drive visual literacy home as we discuss it over the next few weeks. We hope that you will continue to join us. You'll be able to see us here Monday and Friday morning at 7 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. That's 6 a.m. for the West Coast and 9 a.m. for the East Coast afternoon for our friends overseas. Wherever you're hanging out with us, whether that's YouTube or Facebook, come back to that same place. We will be there. Thanks, Matt. Don't forget to let folks know that we're here if you found this valuable this morning. Let other people know, share this video with them, tag them, and then come and join the Facebook group, The Artist Forge on Facebook. It is private for the protection of our members. All you got to do is request and answer a couple questions. We would love to get you in there and make you become part of these conversations and hopefully use your work in the future as examples of beautiful ways people can continue to learn and grow in their visual literacy skills. So until Friday morning, huge thanks to everybody who was here this morning, like Lindsay and Justin and Sharon, our friend, our Facebook user friend, that I don't know who it is. Who is it?
Jason.
Jason. Welcome, Jason. And Nina and everybody who's here. So glad to have you guys. And of course, as always, big thanks to our incredible mentors, founders, and co-hosts, Matt, Bassam, Kat, and Becca, for sharing their time with us this morning. And baby kitty, tiny void floof. Aw. Okay. Until Friday, y'all have a good week. Go make something amazing. Bye, friends.